Hi, and welcome back. So, in this first main section of the lecture, we're going to think about the agency of epidemics. Now, agency is a term that historians use in a lot of cases to describe the agency of different sorts of historical actors or things, and you may not be familiar with this concept. The idea of agency means that something has the ability to cause historical change, that it has the ability to shape narratives, to affect change, to act independently to affect change. Now, we generally tend to think, especially in terms of colonialism, about the agency of colonialism laying with European powers. At least that's the traditional narrative of European colonialism, right? That the English decide we're going to go to Virginia, so we go to Virginia and establish a colony, and it is about the English decisions that they make in shaping that colony. And we have increasingly come to realize that agency also lies with the other side, right? That indigenous people have the agency to shape the way that Europeans interacted with in Virginia, for example, or that enslaved Africans have the agency to dictate certain elements of the way that the system of slavery plays out. And so this agency is a big concept in the history of slavery in that way. But what we want to do here is think about, well, what does it mean if epidemics have agency? What does it mean if actually the whole development of empire is in some respects and to some extent framed by what epidemic diseases, by what contagions allow Europeans to do in different places. Now, of course, in any case, in any situation, nobody has an absolute monopoly on agency. And so we shouldn't assume, and in these few slides in this section, we shouldn't assume that what I am trying to imply here is that in some ways disease shapes everything about the way that empires are structured and develop over the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. But what I want to do here is to think about some of the ways in which disease does inform and shape the ways that Europeans make decisions on the ground about different things, primarily about where they colonize in what ways. So let's start off and recap a little bit what we covered in the introductory lecture by thinking about the ways that disease dictates the starting points of English colonial America. And that starting point most famously is Jamestown. Now, one of the reasons that the English Empire in the Americas gets off to such a shaky start in the Chesapeake Bay and in Virginia is because of the choice and selection of Jamestown. As you may or may not know, Jamestown lies in what English people named the James River, what the Powhatans knew as the Powhatan River, one of the lowest of the rivers that flow into the Chesapeake Bay. You can see in the slightly reduced graphic here, the grayed out graphic, the James River being the bottom of the rivers flowing into the Chesapeake Bay, and roughly at the first major bend in the James River, you can see blown up a modern satellite image of Jamestown. Now, the English settled in Jamestown for a number of reasons that are too complicated to get into here, mainly strategic, that this was a place they thought was more defendable than Roanoke, where they had previously failed to colonize. But one of the problems with Jamestown was that it lay at a certain point along these large estuarine rivers. It lay at a point where fresh and salt water met. So largely the water in that area is what we would know as brackish. It's a mixture of salt and fresh water, because this is where the tidal influence sort of starts to wane up this major estuarine river. And also Jamestown is extremely low-lying in this fresh saltwater transition zone. And that had tremendous implications. What it meant was that the water that flowed past Jamestown and that the colonists relied upon to drink could never be guaranteed to be salt-free. At certain points of the year, it was very salty. The fresh saltwater transition actually moves. In the spring, of course, it moves downriver because more fresh water is flowing out of the river, and so it pushes the salt water further down the river. In the summer and in the autumn, it creeps back up as the flow out of the river reduces. And so And so the salt water comes back. And so what it means is that in front of Jamestown, constantly through the early 17th century, is a mixture of fresh and salt water, with the river actually flowing both ways in some respects. That means that the water there is salty, which is not good from a salt poisoning perspective, as one kind of vector for disease, and one cause of disease, in fact, is salt poisoning, because the level of salt in the water there is much too high. But also the salt freshwater transition meant, and that sort of lack of regular flow of water down the river meant that any waste that was thrown into the river didn't actually flow away and down into the ocean like you would expect it to in most places, and like it did in most English rivers. It actually would stay there, particularly at certain times of the year when the river was changing direction and flow. You would actually have human waste and animal waste and all sorts of things floating around in the river, and it wouldn't actually move. And so this creates an extremely unhealthy bacterial mix at Jamestown, combined with the fact that not only are colonists using the river right next to them, you can see in the picture below, which is an image from Jamestown Island in the archaeology, how close the river is to the edge of where the fort was and where archaeologists have now found the fort, but that they would use the river water directly, but they would also end up using it even though they dug wells. Archaeologists have revealed that colonists in Jamestown in the first 20 years dug more than 20 wells. So they're digging a well every year almost. And all of the records we have are that as soon as wells were dug, they would fill up with river water, this brackish river water. And that brackish river water is contaminated with this human waste, which is not flowing away. And so it's a breeding ground for typhoid and dysentery that just return year after year. And these are not the kinds of diseases that these colonists gain immunity to. So in the midst of the times when they're suffering from famine, they're under attack from indigenous populations, they are also experiencing incredible bouts with disease, with typhoid and dysentery. And you can see in the quote that I provide you from William Strachey in 1610 that he says Jamestown had no fresh water springs. So there's wells are 6 or 7 fathoms deep, and they're fed by brackish river water. And he says, "Verily, I believe these are the causes that have preceded many diseases and sicknesses which have happened to our people." And so Jamestown is this incredibly unhealthy place. The other way you can see this actually, by looking at the satellite image here, is you can see quite how low-lying Jamestown Island, which is the island right in the middle of the satellite image here, that kind of looks like the shape of a guitar almost. And you can see that the whole south end of the island is basically swamp. You can tell it's barely distinguishable from the river in certain places there. And even where the settlement is, where you can see just up near the isthmus that connects it to the mainland, that this is very low-lying. No part of it is more than about 4 or 5 feet above sea level. And anybody who's been there, you might have, especially if you go there in the summer, you can notice the mosquitoes, the heat, the low-lying swampy character of the island. So it has got all of these disease vectors. Now, why am I telling you this? Right? Well, the story here is that Jamestown is supposed to be this first English venture, right? But in many respects, Virginia hobbles along through 20 years of colonialism. It isn't until the beginning of the 1620s that Virginia really starts to take off as a viable colonial society. And one of the reasons for that is that Jamestown is perpetually assaulted by disease. And in fact, Jamestown, as a result, never really becomes a center for Virginia. Settlement, in fact, along the James River disperses. In many cases, governors through the 16 teens actually encourage colonists to move up the river to near areas near modern-day Richmond, Virginia, or down to Newport News, and areas that we now think of as Newport News. And these places basically lead to a dispersed settlement pattern, which actually encourages the development of tobacco agriculture and dispersal across large areas of the Powhatan Confederacy, which in turn sparks warfare and leads to violent confrontation between the English and indigenous populations, or more violent confrontation than there would otherwise have been. And so the point here is that Virginia's settlement character and its conspicuous and repeated failures in the eyes of Europeans, in the eyes of English commentators, lay in the fact that they decided to select this location that left them open to the assault of disease in particular ways. And the way that we can see that as being distinctive and put that into contrast with something else is that we can see the development of a rival colony that was actually supported and connected to Virginia in the early years. That rival colony is Bermuda, and the origins of Bermuda actually lay in a Virginia Company ship that was traveling in the winter of 1609 to Jamestown. And it got separated from the rest of the ships, it got caught in a storm, and miraculously was washed up on the coral off the coast of Bermuda. Every single person on that ship was able to, that ship known as the Sea Venture, was able to survive and make it onto land in Bermuda. The story of the Bermuda shipwreck is central to Virginia's development in this period, because these people survive, but they're cut off on this unoccupied island in Bermuda, and it's unoccupied by indigenous populations either. But in the process of doing that, they're able to find supplies and food on Bermuda and actually rebuild 2 new ships that they then sail on to Virginia the following spring. The miraculous survival of the Sea Venture shipwreck actually provides, many people believe, the inspiration for Shakespeare's The Tempest. But the survival of the Sea Venture alerted English colonists and investors to the fact that Bermuda, whilst Virginia was struggling with disease and with starvation, Bermuda had provided, without any infrastructure, the basis for Europeans to survive for a whole winter successfully. The point being that with a lack of indigenous population and a lack of disease and secure access to all of these things that allowed disease to be minimized, Bermuda was successful. And so, in fact, in the 16 teens, within about 4 or 5 years, the Virginia Company had established a spin-off company called the Somers Island Company, which was a separate subsidiary that settled Bermuda. And actually, that becomes an overnight success. It is in Bermuda that the English first experiment and develop tobacco agriculture. It is in Bermuda that they first experiment with bringing enslaved labor into an English colony. It is in Bermuda that all of these developments happen, because mortality rates in Bermuda in the 16 teens are much lower than they are in Virginia, for all sorts of reasons, but disease being one of them. And so in some respects, the development of Virginia and the kind of parallel success of Bermuda related to disease tells us the ways in which disease shapes this foundation of English empire. Now, on the opposite end of the extreme, Jamestown is a success in comparison with other English ventures in this period. While Bermuda represents an isolated rock in the middle of the Atlantic from which they're safe from disease, Jamestown represents this disease-ridden location, but one that they are able to spread out up and down the James. The other location that the English are particularly excited by in the first 2 decades of the 17th century is Guyana and the mouth of the Amazon. Now, they're excited by this for a number of reasons, partly because they're able to trade with the Spanish there surreptitiously, because they discovered the importance of tobacco, also because they persist in this myth that potentially Guyana is a source of another city of gold, another El Dorado up the Amazon River. So the English are obsessed, just like the Dutch are and the French are, with settlements in Guyana in this period. And you can see from there, the English attempt colonies in 1604, before Jamestown, another one in 1609, another one in 1612, and another one in 1620. These big investments in Guyana colonies. Now, in these places, they encounter significant disease, competition, and geopolitical differences, right? They encounter larger, more organized indigenous populations who are more used to European contact because they've been confronting the Spanish for a long period of time. They also confront the Spanish, who are more interested in excluding them from these areas. But they also encounter a much more vicious disease environment in which, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time, malaria is already beginning to take hold. And so Guyana becomes this place where all of these ventures see horrific levels of mortality in the 1604 through 1620 ventures. And all of them end up fizzling out because of internal divisions, but also because of the heavy mortality that disease creates in these places. So this particularly intense tropical environment makes it much harder for the English to initially establish a colonial presence there. And so we can see here between Jamestown, Bermuda, and Guyana in these first 20 years a real diversity of ways in which disease shapes different kinds of settlement. But I should also add here, just to tack onto this, that the Guyana survivors from a couple of these ventures, and particularly the 1620 venture, the Guyana survivors from the 1620 venture do begin to find a model for establishing themselves in a tropical location. The survivors of the 1620 venture, led by one of the commanders on the ground, a guy called Sir Thomas Warner, or he's Thomas Warner at the time, actually flee from Guyana in 1621 and go head up into the smaller islands of the Antilles chain, and they head towards the island of St. Kitts. And Warner has heard or knows about the island of St. Kitts and establishes a settlement there that goes on to become the first English Caribbean island colony. Now, why is that significant? Why are they able to succeed in St. Kitts in a way that they haven't been able to in Guyana, both of these very clearly in the tropics zone? Well, it's to do with the island ecology, right? It's to do with the fact that St. Kitts and most of the other smaller islands in the Caribbean chain have different varieties of mosquitoes, and different kinds of access to fresh water and to different kinds of ecology that mean that diseases don't develop and spread as badly in those places as they do on the mainland of South America. They're also further from the Portuguese settlements in Brazil, which are probably the first places where malaria begins to appear in the Americas. And so in those ways, again, we see another way in which the ecology of this disease means that Guyana provides not the best model for establishing a tropical colony, but St. Kitts provides a model for doing that. So let's turn then and think, why though are Europeans and English people interested in the Americas specifically at all? I mean, from the late 15th century, Europeans had been traveling down the coast of Africa from before the time of Columbus. They had reached around the coast of Africa. They'd been tracing the flows of gold, particularly, across North Africa. They were desperately trying to cut out the Muslim middlemen who were carrying the gold from West Africa across the Sahara by sailing around and into West Africa directly. So there were tremendous riches on offer in Africa. So why go to this huge effort to settle in the Americas but not focus on Africa? And the reason is that West Africa has the most difficult disease environment for Europeans of anywhere in the world in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. It is marked by the endemic incidence of malaria and yellow fever, but also of other diseases like bilharzia, transmitted in water, yaws, the swelling disease transmitted by and guinea worm, the transmission of worms that will eat into your flesh. These are all different kinds of bacteria and diseases that Europeans encounter in West Africa that they don't encounter anywhere else. It is for these reasons that West Africa becomes informally known throughout the 17th and the 18th century as the, quote, white man's grave. So Africa is this place where heavy disease tolls and epidemics make it almost impossible for them to survive. We see this most particularly, they fail to establish any permanent settlements on the West African coast. They build fortifications in places, but very small numbers of people, very small beachheads of people through the 16th and 17th centuries. They're not able to provide, to establish firm bases, and they actually mostly just trade along the coast and come into ports, purchase gold, and then increasingly enslave people, but they don't establish permanent presences. One place where Europeans are trying in the early part of the 17th century to establish, in the late 16th, early 17th century, to establish permanent presence is in Madagascar. Now, one of the reasons they're doing that is because they're particularly interested in waypoints around southern Africa and on the east coast of Africa as part of the increasingly important trade to the East Indies, to India, to what we think of as Indonesia. So the Dutch, the Portuguese, the English are all interested in places where they can stop and refresh their ships on this East India trade. And Madagascar seems to be a perfect location for that. It has rich resources, tropical environment with almost perfect year-round seasons for growing it seems like a great location to establish new kinds of colonial ventures. And so all of these empires are engaged in direct plans for colonialism that borrow from the initial American forays, actually, from the 16th and early 17th century forays in English America, for example. The English borrow those models and apply them to Madagascar. Think about a Virginia model very explicitly for a settlement in Madagascar. Through the 1640s, they attempt to establish 3 different colonial ventures in Madagascar. In the south part in Augustine Bay, and then later in the very northeast corner in a place called Nosy Be. That these places are intended to be settler colonial places where you're going to send planters who are going to grow crops, and they're going to supply the East India Company ships as they come around on their way to India. The problem with Madagascar, though, just like with other parts of Africa, is the endemic nature of malaria. And Madagascar, in fact, is central to malarial vectors because it actually contains all 4 of the major subspecies of mosquito that carry malaria. So this is a place where almost all of the mosquitoes are carrying some form of malarial infection at this point, and are really, and so this is a place where disease has a huge impact on initial settlements. You get death rates that are, 3/4 to 3/4 to 4/5 of the initial settlement in Augustine Bay are decimated by disease, and also by the attacks from well-organized Malagasy populations and tribal groups who are opposed to English and other settlement. And the way in which this impacts all these empires is indicative from the fact that the English in Augustine Bay actually abandoned this colony and set up a cemetery for those who have died of disease in their colony in Augustine Bay. And if you go there today, even, there are still surviving an English cemetery, a Dutch cemetery, and a Portuguese cemetery. And on the other side of the island, you have the French outpost at Fort Dauphin, which survived for about 20 or 30 years, but eventually also succumbed to this incredibly difficult disease environment. So there is actually efforts at settler colonialism in Africa in this period, and in particular in Madagascar, and they demonstrate that it's basically impossible for Europeans because of the nature of the diseases. What's really problematic about these diseases is that they continue to be endemic, and Europeans cannot really establish enough immunity in large enough numbers throughout the 17th and 18th century. We've got English records from Cape Coast, particularly, which is one of the centers of English West Africa. You can see Cape Coast Castle in modern-day Ghana pictured here, which is kind of taken over by the English in the mid-17th century. By 1684, there are soldiers being sent, and a quarter of them are dying within 6 months in 1684. But zoom forward nearly 100 years to 1769, and the English are sending new detachments of soldiers in the midst of a much different world a century later. And yet, of the 48 people they're sending to Cape Coast in 1769 as a relief detachment, 40 of them are dead within 4 months. So the effects of these diseases do not let up. There isn't a development of any kind of immunity, which we'll be thinking about in the next section of this lecture, the way that they conceptualize and think about immunity as seasoning. But seasoning as a concept of inherited immunity from being in these places doesn't seem to happen in Africa. You get incidence of mortality rates of roughly 30 to 60, 70% amongst the first year of people arriving on the West African coast, but that's followed up by 8 to 12% mortality rates ongoing. So even if you make it through the first year, your chances of dying of disease in any subsequent year is roughly 10%. And that contrasts with kind of levels in the Chesapeake that never really go much beyond 5% in a year-on-year basis. There's an initial seasoning period, but once you survive that, you've got a sort of 5% chance of dying every year, not that much higher than in Europe. So Africa is incredibly limiting in that respect. It also means that it's very difficult, even if you kept on sending people and just kept sending populations as they do initially in the Americas to get over this. The problem is that you never are able to send the right kinds of skilled craftsmen. And the English deal with this in Cape Coast, for example, throughout the 18th century. They are trying to renovate the castle to expand, and let's not forget here that this is the center of the English slave and the British slave trade by the 18th century, a really critical lynch point for their barbaric trade in enslaved people. But they're trying to build this huge fortification and its massive dungeons for enslaved people. They actually don't have the resources to maintain those buildings. The guy who's responsible for renovating them in the 1740s struggles for almost a decade, because every time he brings in a plumber to fix the drains, or the carpenter to fix up some of the doors, or the woodwork in the building, they promptly die within a couple of months. And in fact, the guy who's renovating it eventually gets it done, and then he dies too. So disease here makes it almost impossible for them to develop skilled labor, skilled white labor. And as a result, what you end up with is actually a situation where you have skilled African labor developing. Enslaved people who don't end up being sold into the transatlantic slave trade remain in these coastal castles and these coastal forts. They represent a majority of the population in these places, and they are trained in skilled labor by certain Europeans who come over. They train a number of people, and then they, for as long as it takes, and then they succumb to disease. But you've got this skilled African labor force. And of course, the African population, although there is horrific mortality here, the African population does have certain immunity to malaria, yellow fever, etc. And we'll be thinking, and again in the next section, about how Europeans conceptualize that immunity. But that immunity means that this skilled African labor force is actually increasingly educated and has a much greater degree of autonomy. The enslaved people who are not, therefore, sold into the Atlantic trade live in a very different world on the African coast because of the nature of the mortality and the disease environment there. And so in some respects, the whole African slave trade that develops, the trade in human beings, is a product of the fact that Europeans have to adapt a system in Africa that reflects their weakness, effectively, their inability to conquer and occupy territory because of the disease environment. And so their reliance upon dealing with local populations to purchase enslaved people. There are obviously many, many other incentives that they operate in to purchase enslaved labor, and many, many racial assumptions that they bring to that about indigenous American versus African labor that inform all of this. But there is a crucial element here to recognize that all of this is built around the fact that Europeans can't operate in Africa in the same ways that they can in the Americas. The problem for Europeans, though, as we enter the mid to late 17th century, is that trade in enslaved Africans actually brings with it the diseases that they most dread in Africa to the Americas, particularly yellow fever and malaria, the two that are most transferable. They transfer for different reasons, and if I dig down a little bit here, I'm certainly no biologist, but I'll dig down a little bit into the ecology of the mosquitoes that carry these diseases. Yellow fever is passed along by only one species of mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, that lives particularly in fresh water and doesn't travel that far, which means that it's attracted to barrels of water that ships might be carrying from Africa across, and it's not inclined to fly off the boat, so it will stay on a boat and have a couple of life cycles as it crosses the Atlantic with access to fresh water, or reasonably fresh water, in the barrels that sailors are carrying to drink on that voyage. And so we know that it is West African strains of the yellow fever virus that make it to the Americas, because in fact we can test the strains of different yellow fever that operate in Africa, and there are many, many of them. But we can test the strains of yellow fever that operate in the Americas, and there is only one, and it is identical to the West African strain. So we know that it is through the transportation of these mosquitoes from the west coast of Africa to the Americas that yellow fever gets brought. Malaria is a slightly different beast. Lots of different kinds of mosquitoes, mainly in the Anopheles variety of mosquitoes can transfer malaria and can transmit malaria, but there's a number of different subspecies within that group, and many of those already existed in the Americas. Some of them more capable of spreading malaria than others. As I already mentioned, the ones on the smaller islands of the Caribbean chain don't tend to be as good at transmitting malaria as the ones on the mainland, and particularly the ones in South America, and the ones in North America, the southern part of North America, that are very good at transmitting malaria. So that means that you get a sort of diverse variety of different kinds of ecologies for malaria that spread out in the Americas. But in that case, it's not the mosquitoes that cross the Atlantic, but it is the people who are sort of survivors of malaria, but who carry malaria in their bloodstream, because malaria can kind of come back repeatedly through somebody's life. So they can carry the malaria virus, and then they travel to the Americas, they get bitten by one of these mosquitoes that can transfer it, and then it propagates itself. So both of these diseases then are imported in different ways through the mosquito-human combination of vectors and establish an ecology in the Americas. Now, one of the reasons they are able to establish a new ecology in the Americas is actually because of the changes that happen in the Caribbean. So malaria takes off in Brazil and in the Caribbean because of the changes that intensive agriculture and large-scale slavery bring to these regions. Obviously, they bring enslaved labor, which means they bring lots of people who might be carrying the malaria virus, and they bring lots of ships. That means there's a lot of shipping directly from West Africa to these places. It also means that the sugar brings dense populations that need to live together to process the sugar. It means that they need large amounts of water, fresh water, normally to power mills, and that is a great breeding ground for Aedes aegypti. And they also bring with them lots of monkeys that they actually carry from Africa and become native to these islands and to societies around the Caribbean basin. And those monkeys provide another vector for transmitting and perpetuating both yellow fever and malaria. So in all of these ways, the transformations that sugar and the intensive sugar agriculture and plantation agriculture in the Caribbean make a perfect breeding ground for large numbers of these Aedes aegypti, particularly the yellow fever Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. And so we have these huge waves of infection. We know that malaria begins to trickle into South America by the late 16th century and kind of gradually increases, and particularly in these areas where the mosquitoes are most prone to transmitting it. But yellow fever really arrives like a wave with the development of the plantation economy. And we can see in this narrow period from 1647 to 52 the intense explosion of yellow fever, this plague that wipes out huge numbers of people in Barbados, just as the sugar revolution, the transformation of intensive sugar agriculture, which begins on Barbados. It's a different story for another class that I teach. But the intensive development of sugar in Barbados in these years really leads itself to the explosion of yellow fever in this period too. And of course, it also helps to encourage the doubling down, though, on enslaved labor, because many Africans have a much greater immunity to both of these critically dangerous diseases to Europeans. They gain immunity to yellow fever because often yellow fever is a lot less deadly to children, just as we are seeing with the current COVID-19. It has a much lower incidence of death in children, but once children get it, they acquire immunity. So if you have lived and grown up in an area where it's endemic, then you're much more likely to have developed immunity to it by the time you're an adult. Malaria, by contrast, African populations have long, over millennia, developed genetic abilities to fight off malarial infections through genetic modifications, most particularly the sickle cell trait, right, which makes Africans some populations of West Africans more immune to malaria. So this African population is more immune to malaria. You get this explosion of malaria and yellow fever in the mid-17th century in the Caribbean, which in fact doubles down on the development of plantation slavery and the logic that Africans are more suited, quote unquote, suited to the labor of Caribbean sugar production. And from there, then, that is the background that you need to understand the McNeill reading that you've been asked to do for today. To think about how he then goes on to show that the rising amount of yellow fever and malaria really limits what Europeans can do, because it limits their ability to then capture new places, to overturn current existing populations, because of the fact that populations that are then living in the Caribbean develop immunity, and armies from Europe really struggle in this new environment to be able to survive in large enough numbers to compete and to exert authority. And so you can see, hopefully, in these questions I've asked, think initially on the most basic level about the way that the arrival of this disease changes the dynamics of European imperialism in the Caribbean. And then think about how the ecology here of these different places complicates the relationship between epidemics and geopolitics. This is not simply Europeans who have like one disease that they are particularly kind of susceptible to and are able to avoid. They don't really understand the vectors that are propagating this disease, and so this complicates it. They don't really understand how immunity is developed to these diseases, and so they're in some respects fighting blind, and fighting in these different kinds of ways creates different dynamics for empires trying to exert control, both on the most basic level of sort of military control, but also on a sort of state level control over these places. Because of trying to bring in European colonists as opposed to enslaved Africans. But it's also worth thinking here, and as I said at the beginning of this section, that this environmental determinism, this environmental agency can't explain everything, right? So when we're looking at McNeill's argument, and in the book from which this argument is taken, he's very upfront about the fact that there are limitations to this argument. There are other things going on here. And so as you read this, think about the ways that maybe this explains certain parts of this. What does it leave unanswered? How do we think about environmental determinism in ways that are that position it amongst other causalities of imperial change and development, and of the geopolitics of this empire is able to conquer this island or this piece of territory, and this other empire isn't able to recapture it, and so forth. The larger point here is that this continues, actually. The pattern that McNeill traces in the reading that you have continues in his own book, as he traces the way in which it ultimately hampers French and European efforts to actually reconquer the Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti after the Haitian Revolution. And so the way in which the Haitian Revolution in some respects is successful because of the lack of European immunity to these diseases. And so it has these bigger implications that go beyond the period that you're reading about. And it really isn't until the 19th century that Europeans begin to think about arming themselves, or begin to have the ability to arm themselves with the scientific knowledge to protect their own populations in different disease environments. And so we get into the 19th century, particularly in India, for example, where the East India Company and then the British government, who takes over in the 1850s, establishes what's known as the Indian Medical Service, that specializes in treating and helping soldiers and English colonial officials to survive in this tropical environment and exert authority. And so empires can only then begin to adjust, and then you get a different wave of colonialism that's able to operate in other tropical environments. But of course, you can again see there are lots of complications here. There are certain tropical environments where Europeans are already operating before this. So there are ways in which they're able to get around these realities of disease, but they do constrain them in other ways. And it's useful to think about diseases having historical agency that factors in with other elements of the agency that explain the development of these changes. And so that's the first part of this. We'll go on to now think about the way that Europeans themselves conceptualize disease and what they're doing in colonialism in the next part of this.